Well, with the SEC and the Big Ten pulling away, are the ACC and the Big 12 actually doomed to fail?
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This is your daily source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Realignment, coaching carousel, the portal, and more. We've always got you covered. Today's episode is brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the next corner? Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Check them all out today at nissanusa.com. We'll check in Oxford, Mississippi with Lane Kiffin and Stephen Willis of Locked On Ole Miss. Just Willis is going to be on the show, though, which is a pretty darn good guest to have. And Nick Saban, boy, did you see what he said? We'll talk about that later as well. But the Big 12 and the ACC have the same problem, and that's that they face an existential crisis of how do they compete with the Big 10 and the SEC, and more fundamentally, can they actually just continue to exist in this world? I think they can. I think they can because the Big 10 and the SEC right now are drunk on power. That's how it feels. They didn't need to add Texas and Oklahoma in the SEC. They wanted to. The Big Ten didn't need Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA. They didn't need those teams. They just wanted them. But the world that could take place, or that could exist, in which the Big 12 and the ACC completely dissolve and don't exist. I'm not talking about the two of them getting together to form their own number 3 Super League, which could be its own discussion. That's fascinating to say the least. The Big Ten and the SEC can't really flex their muscle if they don't have the other conferences to compare themselves to. Because a breakaway by the Big Ten and the SEC, in which they just play their own championship and they've got their own postseason structure and they're just making this stuff up and it's just for the Big Ten and the SEC. Maybe they'd pull some teams along like Florida State and Miami and Clemson and North Carolina, and out of the Big 12, maybe get like Utah and Oklahoma State and Baylor or TCU or whomever they deem worthy of being in their breakaway league. If they're going to do something like that, a lot of things have to take place. But right now, in the environment that we do have, which is certainly an unstable one, Florida State's actively trying to get out of the ACC, what you can't look at is what you have to look at rather, is how the Big Ten and the SEC are actually able to flex their muscle. And that's by comparison. How do you know? When I just say the Big Ten and the SEC are the power two, and then there's the next two, and then there's a group of 5. That's the way that FBS college football is structured. When I say that, you know the power two are the Big Ten and the SEC. But how do you know that? Because they're being compared directly to the Big 12 and the ACC. And if you want to continue to grow the allure, to grow the, not mystique, but kind of the grandiose nature of those two conferences, you know what you have to continue to do? Flex your muscle over those two leagues. Not just by pulling teams into your, 2-team super conference that's starting to formulate and may very well just come to exist in college football one day. You've got to be able to go out and beat them on the field. You've got to be able to go out and say, look, we're the ones winning all the national championships, but you lose that argument if you're not even competing in the same league where the Big 12 and the ACC don't have the opportunity to. So, no, I don't want the Big 10 and the SEC to, number one, grow any further, and number two, I don't want them to break off from the current model of college sports. Because my favorite television show of all time is The West Wing, and it's fantastic. And there's a line in that in which CJ Craig is talking to Josh Lyman and says, "The fall's gonna kill you." And that line is easily transferable to what popped into my head, which is the hope's gonna kill you. And you know what? The hope is gonna kill you if you're the Big 12 and the ACC. Could you ever hope to win a national championship if you're the Big 12 or the ACC? Let's say Florida State and Clemson, for instance, end up leaving the ACC. But the two leagues are left in place. They're not going to have as many automatic bids. They're going to be a competitive and financial disadvantage. It is going to be ridiculously hard to win a national championship. It's still harder to win it if you're not even allowed any seats at the table whatsoever. And in this potential 14 or 16 team playoff where the Big Ten and the SEC gobble up all the bids, they wouldn't gobble up literally all of the bids. They'd be gobbling up metaphorically all of the bids. And so to keep everyone else engaged and to keep your relevance as an actual national champion, you can't just decide we're not going to go against them. Because then you're just fighting a Twitter war, essentially. You're just fighting a battle of, well, on paper we're better in this and we can do that and we could do this and all that sort of stuff. You can do that as much as you want, but until the results on the field are actually played, you can't deem yourself to be the national champion. On paper, college basketball is very different. I am the first to admit that. But on paper, San Diego State shouldn't be able to compete with Alabama basketball. Last year they did. Went all the way to the national championship game. And yeah, in football, it's a lot harder to make up that gap because you don't have 5 guys on the court. You've got 22 guys on the field. So the talent gap can really start to show through. But if you give no hope, no possibility, a 0% chance, you just have to give fans and the sport in general a 1% chance. And you can get people excited to continue to play. Just a chance, an opportunity. You never know. What if you get to the game and the other team's big star goes down with an injury? I'm not saying you're rooting for that, but what if it happens? Changes the calculus, doesn't it? If you were to play the Alabama team with Bryce Young that went to the national championship game and you were, I don't know, let's say 2022's TCU. If that TCU team plays that Alabama team with Bryce Young, Alabama, I think, wins. But if you take Bryce Young out of that equation on some fluke injury, look at Brock Purdy in the NFL, for instance, in the conference title game a couple of years ago against the Eagles. You can't have the opportunity if you're not presented the chance to play in that sort of game. So that's why even as the Big Ten and the SEC are once again vultures circling around, looking to see what other schools they can add, who provides value, what sort of additive move can we make here that's going to make us an even stronger conference. The Big 12 and the ACC, they'll be significantly weakened. They already are compared to what the Big 10 and the SEC are. But if you remove all hope, it's a 1% chance now, maybe a little bit higher than that, but if you say it's a 1% chance now, well, that's still a lot higher and a lot different than 0%. Switching topics here, is Lane Kiffin a long-term guy at Ole Miss? That's an interesting question right there. Here's an interesting question for you. Have you checked out Nissan? Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little bit further? Ever wonder what adventure could be around the corner? Our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capabilities to take your adventure to the next level. The 2024 Nissan Rogue, for instance. It's perfect for city drives and great escapes. Class exclusive Google built-in is your always updating assistant to call on for almost anything. Gone are the days of connecting your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play Store are built right into the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system. The 2024 Rogue is the perfect midsize crossover for your next adventure. Maybe you want to check out the Pathfinder or the Armada, both of which have an 8-seat capacity and tons of power. The Pathfinder, for instance, 6,000 pounds of towing. Everything you want in a truck is over there at Nissan, or in an SUV rather. That's what they've got over there. You need to go check them out. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Go to shop.nissanusa.com. That's nissanusa.com. Go over there and check them out. Can Ole Miss keep Lane Kiffin around? His name popped up as a target for Florida State if Mike Norvell had been the selection for Alabama. So we talk about that, of course, with Stephen Willis, host of Locked On Ole Miss, joining me here on today's show. Is Lane Kiffin a forever guy in Oxford?
Probably not. I mean, I don't know if a forever guy actually exists anymore. In case you're somebody like Nick Saban, that goes on. I think eventually Lane Kiffin's going to go do something else because that's the nature of things. Now, that being said, I know what article you're talking about. It was on that Nick Saban story about him leaving, and that Florida State was going to turn their attention to Lane Kiffin if Mike Norvell took the Alabama job. And it's like, that's a completely one-sided thing and not newsworthy at all. It's kind of like, hey, if my wife leaves me, my first choice is going to be Sydney Sweeney. It's absolutely nuts. There's something one side of that conversation that is real, but I guess, I mean, it's the clickbaitiest of clickbaitiest stuff right there because Lane Kiffin gets clicks. That's what it is. But I do think he will eventually leave Oxford. He's not a forever coach, but that quote from Florida State is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard.
I think it's smart from Florida State to say, hey, that's where our attention would be. That's the sort of caliber of coach that we'd be searching for. I think Florida State in the ACC, as the Power 2, the Big Ten, and the SEC are trying to really distinguish themselves and pull away from the other two leagues, I think that can make Ole Miss a more attractive place to be than Tallahassee. But we've seen the Florida State program get to a level where Ole Miss has not. Now, I think Ole Miss, as we're going to get to a little bit later in the segment as well, is very good in 2024. It can get to a level maybe we haven't seen them arrive at yet. But on the surface, Steven, that's kind of the pitch, right? It is for Lane Kiffin to stay at Ole Miss, he would have to be completely void of offers of jobs where you'd say, well, this place is probably a better job. And Florida State on the surface, I think, can be better, especially if they leave the ACC.
Well, that's the rub, because you're going to have to pay a certain amount of money to get out of the ACC, which means they may not be at the level financially as successful as even some place like Ole Miss. Now, if you look at the Venn diagram of how good of a program and the programs that are better jobs than Ole Miss, even for Lane Kiffin, there's probably 5 or 6 programs in the whole country at this point. And the rest of them, the next level is Ole Miss is kind of even with them. Now, the other thing that people don't even talk about whenever they think they're very money obsessed is Ole Miss lets him do whatever he wants to do. Do you think Lane Kiffin at Alabama or at Texas would be able to go in the middle of March deep sea fishing? No, he wouldn't. But at Ole Miss, he has that power to do that. So I do think that quality of life and what he's building, mixed with the fact that he's making nearly $9 million a year, means that he's going to be there as long as he wants to be there. Eventually, I think he's going to go, but I don't think it's anytime soon.
Do you think he would leave for a better college job in his view, or do you think he is trying to get back to the NFL?
I think that honestly, Lane Kiffin is going to milk this college thing for as much as he can, but his next job will probably be the NFL because the college requirements around coaching right now are just so crazy.
Well, it certainly was for Saban and for Harbaugh, and Jeff Hafley, and Chip Kelly wasn't a fan of it, so he wouldn't be the first guy to make that sort of move. I think the question is, would an NFL team want to hire? Maybe as an offensive coordinator, but again, we just saw a coach go from a Power 5 coaching position to a coordinator spot. Would Lane Kiffin do that? Maybe, maybe not. But I think that in college, we'll wrap this point on this matter, there are only a couple of jobs that if I'm Lane Kiffin, I'm looking at and saying, yeah, that unquestionably puts me in a better situation than what I've got at Ole Miss. Because the Rebels have got the second highest win total in the SEC. I think they're probably a playoff team in 2024. With the 12-team playoff, that's certainly where they should expect to be. But if the job is not Alabama or Georgia, maybe Florida. I mean, they haven't had, the great success that they once did with Urban Meyer and such, but Florida maybe is a job that, I've heard that he was interested in that Florida job when it came open. They gave it to Billy Napier anyway. Those are really the only spots. I don't see him going to the Big Ten or to another power league.
Well, I do not think Florida is an option. People are going to assume Florida is an option. I do not think Florida is an option, and that's not a Lane Kiffin thing. That's a Florida thing towards Lane Kiffin. I think Miami is the real threat, that if you're looking for an outside-the-box school. I think Miami, if they move on from Mario Cristobal, they decide to drop some coin with them being in South Florida because he he vacations down there all the time. I think that is the job that outside of the SEC power jobs that you would probably look at.
I think that they also, like Florida State, would have to leave the ACC for that to happen because there's just so much instability there. But as I talked about on yesterday's show, that's very much a possibility. Let's turn the page to spring football, Stephen, and what Lane Kiffin is working on with his team. They had a great transfer portal this offseason. They've got a bunch of key returners. I am very high on the Rebels. I think they're probably going to be a 10-win team. Their win total on FanDuel is at 9.5. What do they need to work on first going into spring football, which just got underway?
Chemistry, with all those transfers gelling together. In 2022, Ole Miss started out 7-0. They were a little bit front runners because in this new mercenary era of football, that can happen a little bit, and they had some stuff go south on them. They fell back. Last year, Jackson Dart was able to kind of be the lead from the front type of guy, the ultimate competitor type guy, and was able to lead them to 11 wins. Need to make sure that Walter Nolan, Princely Emmanuel, and Chris Paul, those guys fit into what they need to do. They have most of the talent back off an 11-win team. These are just pieces that should theoretically make them a little bit better football team. So we'll see. If they buy in, Ole Miss is going to be really good.
What about Jackson Dart? He had a great season last year, early Heisman contender at this point in the very messed up college football calendar. As we go into spring football, I don't expect that to change once the season gets underway. You know, Lane Kiffin teams are going to score a lot of points. It's going to depend on how well he can play at quarterback. I thought they were a great match last year. I love that they're both back for Ole Miss. It's one of the reasons that I like the Rebels. You got a coach and a quarterback returning. There are not as many teams in college football as you would maybe think that can say that, especially a high-level tandem like these two. But how can Jackson Dart be a better version of himself to help this Ole Miss team?
Right now, he is limited. In January, after the Peach Bowl, he had a procedure done. And basically, I don't know if it's knee scoped. Something happened on the lower body. He needs to gel with the Juice Wells. He needs to make sure he's in line with Trey Harris. He needs to help the young quarterbacks learn this offense. But moving forward, he basically needs to be a lead from the front person throughout spring practice. He needs to make sure the culture goes as it goes. The best Ole Miss teams over the last couple of years were Matt Corral, whenever he was undisputedly the leader of the team. Jackson Dart last year was undisputedly the leader of this team. This needs to be a situation where Jackson Dart makes his presence known, not necessarily in a bad way or anything like that. But if he does that, leads from the front, and gets them willed to go, because last year, Ole Miss might lose 2 games if it just wasn't for Jackson Dart's competitiveness. And his competitiveness against Georgia Tech and against Arkansas, of all teams, was able to come through at the end and make that not necessarily a game, but it was a situation where Ole Miss could win the game. He needs to instill, it's like, hey, I'm the leader of this team. This is my team. This is my thing. He's coined the phrase, not coined the phrase, but he uses the phrase last dance, because it's his last ride through Ole Miss. And because of that, all of the people are latching on to it as well. So it's going to help make him a focal point on the roster, which as a quarterback he already is anyway. But it is nice to see him taking that leadership level to the next level. And if he can, I don't know, if he can make it to where those guys like, hey, I need to do what I'm supposed to do. I know this looks bad, but Jackson Dart's looking at me. I think that's the culture that he is trying to instill on the football team. And I think that's the most important step that he has to make in year 3.
Stephen Willis, Locked On Ole Miss. Catch him on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts as well. Stephen, thanks so much for stopping by.
Thanks, bud.
Kalen DeBoer is taking over for this guy named Nick Saban. And Saban had some comments recently. Yeah, we're going to discuss those. Before we get to Nick Saban's retirement, this episode of Locked On College Football is brought to you by FanDuel. Of course, that's America's #1 sports book. Say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every single game of the tournament. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a 1 seed to run the table, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sports book. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's all you have to do. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. I can't shake the suspicion that North Carolina is going to make a run. I might be picking them depending on what happens in the bracket when it comes out on Selection Sunday to go to the Final Four. If you think I'm crazy, put your money where your mouth is. If you think I'm right, which you should, put your money where your mouth is as well with FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. FanDuel.com/lockedon. Check out America's #1 sportsbook today. Everybody saw what Nick Saban said about his decision to retire, right? If you didn't, allow me to read it to you because this is a rather revealing and indicative of why I tend to side with coaches in the landscape of college football and why everything is so crazy. The calendar is nuts. But here's something else that cannot be overlooked. So, Nick Saban, after last season, in which, remember, Alabama won the SEC, made the college football playoff, and was in overtime with the eventual national champions. That's the team that Nick Saban decided to leave behind, hang up the clipboard, and stop coaching college football for. Quote, "I thought we could have a hell of a team next year, and then maybe 70 or 80% of the players you talk to, all they want to know is two things. What assurances do I have that I'm going to play because they're thinking about transferring? And how much are you going to pay me?" Saban told ESPN's Chris Lowe. "Our program here was always built on how much value we can create for your future and your personal development, academic success in graduating and developing an NFL career on the field." End quote. Actually, quote continues. "So I'm saying to myself, maybe this doesn't work anymore, that the goals and aspirations are just different, and that's all about how much money I can make as a college player. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying that's never been what we were all about, and that's not why we had success through the years," end quote. So this particular remark is indicative of a couple things. Number one, why I am so excited to see Nick Saban on College Game Day. That's the sort of quote you only get when Nick Saban is retired. That sort of insight, that sort of honesty, just getting right to the heart of the matter. I think he's going to be great as a pundit on College Game Day for that very reason. And he can offer stories and insights and trials and tribulations and everything like that for what it's like to be a college football coach in the modern world. But the second point is the most important one, and that's that anyone who pushes back on college coaches who are resistant to all of the change that is taking place in the sport are not fully comprehending how much a coach is having to deal with. And notice Saban said in there, maybe he's being not facetious, but just kind of trying to cover and not cause too much of a firestorm or anything. I'm not saying it's wrong for players to get paid. I'm not saying it's bad or that he's against it. But what he is saying is that the mentality for these college kids and these players has clearly shifted. Not all of them. Because remember, he said in there 70 to 80% of the players you talk to. Well, he's not talking to every single player. But you can't do anything about kids wanting to transfer if you're a head coach. And yeah, that player has got a lot more power than he used to just 3 to 4 years ago before the portal was unleashed. And if you're a head coach, you are definitely having your ability to influence your team diminished in that capacity. Because if you recruit a kid, let's say he's a 4-star recruit at any position, and you don't plan to play him his freshman year, he thinks he could play a little, and maybe he could see some spot work, but he's not ready yet. And there's a development process, and there is a plan to make him the best player that he can possibly be one day. If he's expecting to play at least some in year one and be a starter by year two, but you know he's not going to be a starter. He'll be a player year two, but he won't be a starter until year three, but he's not happy with that. What are you supposed to do about that as a coach? Not recruit a talented player? Because you can't always know. You can't always know which kids are going to be targets to hit the portal. Every fan listening to or watching this show over the last couple of years, I could almost assure you, has had a player leave their team where you went, oh man, that guy left? Why would he leave? I thought he was going to be this. I thought he could be that. And so you give an outsized amount of power to these kids, and they are exercising it, which is what you would expect to have happen. The flaw in this structure and dynamic of college football now is that the kids are allowed to have that much power. And I'm not completely anti-player and pro, organization and corporate, blah, 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 and whatnot. But what I am in favor of is having some structure on this, because when people say the transfer portal is like free agency, no, it is not. There is nothing in professional sports comparable to the college transfer portal, because in the college transfer portal, you can leave at any time. You can stop playing at any time. The school has to honor its commitment to you, but you don't have to honor the commitment to the school. I don't like the world that creates and the dynamic between some players and coaches, which is clearly prevalent, as Saban hints at here. Not really hints at, just kind of openly talks about. And I don't like the message that we send to the kids, that if you're not getting everything you want all the time, to just quit and give up, to just say, no, I'm just leave. Just go somewhere where they're going to cater to everything that is all about you, and it's all about you, and it's not about the team. That's not something that I think is conducive to fostering a strong sport. And that's why you have a lot of these coaches leaving. Now, coaches have always left at some level. That is 100% a fair counterpoint in this particular discussion of, coaches are not wanting to be head coaches, whether that's Chip Kelly or Jim Harbaugh or Nick Saban or Jeff Hafley, Boston College, who went to be a coordinator rather than being a head coach. I think that when you look at the college football world that has been created here, there is a power imbalance. And sure, if you want to argue for the first, 30 years of the sport being on TV and whatnot, it was too far in favor of the NCAA and the universities and not enough in the favor of the players, I could probably agree with that assessment. But right now, the pendulum has swung too far to the other side. That, if you think about a grandfather clock, it goes back and forth and back and forth. It needs to come to rest in the middle. It needs to come to rest in the middle, because there is no way that as a coach you can operate as effectively as you possibly can. I just cannot blame coaches who don't want to deal with this stuff, because there is no professional league in which a player comes to a coach and says, are you going to play me? And are you going to pay me? And if you don't, I'm going to leave. You can't do that in the NBA. There's a punishment for that. It's called a fine for not playing. At least it should be. I don't think Adam Silver's done a good enough job with that sort of stuff. But you can't just not play. You got to have a reason to not play. This is a one-sided commitment. The school is bound to honor the scholarship. And when NIL money changes hands, if the player kind of bows out on the season, player, as far as I know, in a number of NIL situations that I'm aware of personally, the player just goes on and just gets to keep the money. There's no two-sided commitment. So I think that Saban is getting at something that is really important, which is this power imbalance here is not conducive for a healthy work environment. The calendar in college football puts way too much onus on the coaches. You should not be managing your roster at a time when your season is still ongoing. That's completely and utterly ridiculous. I don't know how anybody could argue that. And if your response is, well, coaches are paid so much money, they're so wealthy in this sort of stuff. Okay, and they're being paid market value. But the amount of work that they have to put into a particular amount of time does not make any sense, and neither does this dynamic. Another legendary coach who's talked about this was Gino Auriemma. And Gino Auriemma, the all-time winningest coach in the history of UConn women's basketball, I think he's up there for just one of the all-time winningest basketball coaches ever, was asked after a game, a couple months ago, I think it was at this point, about, all this sort of stuff. And the way he's looking at it is, I don't think that the coaches are as opposed to players getting paid or getting compensated for, being on the team and whatnot, helping generate revenue for the athletic department and these media deals. I don't think they're as opposed to that as some people might think. What coaches are opposed to, and I think they are right for being opposed to, is what Coach Auriemma talked about. And he said, how do you coach a player who feels like you owe them everything and they owe you nothing? That is not how you create the best locker rooms. That's not how you create the best teams. It's not how you get the most out of sports. So player compensation is someone I think almost everybody is behind in some form or fashion. But to say that it should just continue on in the way that it has, I mean, this is the best coach in the history of the sport. Driving those people away, not because of NIL and the portal. I don't think that's what Saban looked at and said. I mean, the portal may be a little bit a part of it there, as he alluded to in his comments. But to say that that's a good sign of where your sport is at, I cannot get behind that. There's got to be a commitment that needs to be honored from the player. And remember, these are college kids. What's the point of college? Prepare you for the real world. Well, in the real world, when you don't get something or you don't get everything that you want all the time, you don't always just have the option to just go run somewhere where they're going to pander to you because they need you a little bit more. I don't like the message that sends. I don't like the culture that fosters in college football. And I think coaches have a sufficiently difficult job without dealing with this sort of stuff. And I hope college football is able to make these sorts of changes, and time will tell if they are. Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.